Welcome to the Crux of Cardio. I'm Jordan Burgin, Head of Cardiovascular at Crux. In 2024, I very nearly suffered a cardiac arrest due to an underlying illness. It was unexpected and it fundamentally changed how I look at the industry. Since joining Crux, my role has been simple but ambitious in practice: to strengthen the cardiovascular ecosystem by supporting the people building it through talent, through fundraising and through community. Helping founders, executive clinicians and investors connect in ways that genuinely move the needle. We started the Crux of Cardio to spotlight the incredible work happening across the cardiovascular space, the technologies, the teams, the setbacks and the breakthroughs, and most importantly, the very real patient impact behind it all. I hope you enjoy this episode. We're back for another episode of Crux of Cardio, and today we're joined by Wayne Paterson, the CEO of Anteris Technologies. Wayne, do you want to go ahead and give yourself a brief introduction?
Sure. Thanks, Jordan. So as Jordan said, I'm Wayne Paterson, CEO and Vice Chairman of Anteris. Anteris is a publicly traded company with a primary listing on the NASDAQ and a secondary listing on the ASX, domiciled here in Minneapolis.
Amazing. And I think some of the guests we've had recently have got quite varied backgrounds. We've had finance, we've had tech med. Again, I think you've got quite a bit of a variety in the start of your career. It'd be good to get a bit of insight as to where you started out.
Sure. So I actually grew up in big pharma. Started my career there. Actually started in the field and spent the better part of a decade at Roche, which of course is a large pharma company, and Merck KGaA. Ended up living in 7 countries with those companies and those jobs, and started with Roche, obviously in Australia, and then hit my management stride going into Shanghai, Roche Shanghai. Way back when, so started in emerging markets. Moved around the world, had different functions. CEO of Japan for 3 years with Merck at one point, president of emerging markets, president of Europe, global head of cardiovascular medicine. So quite a lot of jobs as I moved up to the C-suite of Merck. And of course, with that comes a lot of learning, which is great because I had launched a lot of drugs globally, and very large ones, and you obviously learn a lot doing that. I joined this company as a NED and became chairman, and it was a drug company. So folks maybe don't know that it was not a medtech company. I was not a medtech person. And of course, the drug platform, which I was clearly brought in to support, was not viable either clinically or commercially. And after 36 launches of drugs in my career globally, I can make that assessment, and so I did. And I was faced with the proposition of winding down the company, which was publicly traded on the ASX, at that time, not the NASDAQ. Or finding an investment thesis for the 6,000 or so shareholders that I had on the register. And I was very new to the organization. Didn't have a huge obligation to keep it going, to be honest, other than I didn't want it to fail. And the company had a key technology called ADAPT, which is a collagen material that they were selling, globalizing before I got here for surgical repair, which is a reasonably small revenue space and very commoditized. But they had amazing science on ADAPT. They had very incredibly well-published data showing zero calcification over a 10-year period and so on. And it turns out that collagen material, which the company owned and owned the factory that it manufactured it from, is also the core building block to the space that I pivoted us to, which is TAVR and valves. And you're looking at the difference between something like a $100 million space versus a $10 billion space. And so when I understood that part, once I connected the dots on what is the investment thesis, we wrote the TPP, the target product profile, and the clinical plan, and the go-to-market plan, and the launch plan all at the same time without a product. And the reason I did that is because having launched a lot of global healthcare products worth billions of dollars, you understand that as a small company, you've got to get those things right, or there's no investment thesis, and there's no way you're going to raise capital. And so I ended up bringing down to Minneapolis the physicians from the biggest centers in the country, who were very deliberately chosen. They're very famous people today. They were famous people back then. Chosen for their thought leadership, for their publications, of the volume of publications, for the volume of product that they used in TAVR at the time. So the biggest users, connectivity to Wall Street for some of them, and connectivity across companies, which again, from the pharma industry is a very normal thing. And they all came down to Minneapolis about 8 years ago, when I had a blank sheet of paper, and basically said to them, okay, if you have a new TAVR device, what does it need to look like? And they set us 2 very clear targets. So all of that background taught me how to bring a product to market, how to bring one through the process, even though it was not medtech. And obviously the pharma space is very big, right? Uh, medtech, I think, is 30% the size of pharma, and you're launching $5-6 billion drugs fairly regularly. So that's one TAVR, right? If you take an Edwards, that's their whole company, and you've got 10 of those in your portfolio at, say, Merck or Roche. So there's a different sense of scale. There's a different time frame. The pharma industry has been around for a lot longer, so they've had time to work out, what is the playbook to bring a product to market. And so we just started to apply that same thinking to this product. And the doctor targets that they set us that they were very clear: clinically better and a balloon expandable delivery system. Now, clinically better, you hear from doctors all the time. You just have to unpack what it means, and we did. And I knew if I couldn't hit those, so they were gating items, right? They were go, no go. If we couldn't hit clinically better, and what they meant was Medtronic and Edwards, who were in the market, then there's no investment thesis, there's no way forward. And so then you start the process of, can we actually do this? What are they actually asking for? And it led us to radically change the design of the current products in the market. We, by virtue of the fact that we had to either get clinically better or just shut the company, we end up creating a radically different design, and the first new design of product in this space in about 20 years. And that actually created a product that actually brought patients into a pre-disease state on the objective measurements they use in this disease, which is called mean gradients. It's a pressure reading. The existing products left you in mild disease, believe it or not. And so what the physicians were asking us for is, if you can do this, give us something that's better than mild disease. And so we had to get into the curative state, which was a little weird to me, right? I'm looking at a disease that's fatal if left untreated. There's no pharmacotherapy. There's no drug to treat it. The only way you can treat the disease is to switch out a piece of anatomy, which is the aortic valve. And there's two ways to do that: crack a chest open, stop a heart, put it in surgically, or put it on a catheter and deliver it via transcatheter around the aorta. Now, there's a group of patients who surgically will not survive if you crack their chest. They're called high risk. You can't do it to them. They'll die on the table. And so these catheter-based products were designed for that patient. But the piece of anatomy they're putting back in does not look like the piece you were born with and doesn't behave like it. And that's what struck me as being very odd. The second thing that struck me as strange was that this market hadn't moved in a decade, and there are only two players out there, right? And they were not iterating. They were not changing their device. They were not moving with actually the change in labels and the change in patient population. And again, coming from my industry, where you look at life cycle management, it appeared to me that wasn't happening, and they left a clinical gap in the market that probably shouldn't have been there. And we were able to exploit that with the input from these physicians, although it was clearly not an easy task. I tended to look at this disease a bit like oncology, which is where I grew up a lot of my therapeutic area learning, which is to say we're looking at stage 4 to stage 1. The industry at that time tended to look at these products as a mechanical product and measured the opening and closing and the mean gradients. So I took a total disease management approach with the physicians. They acknowledge that today. They said it forced them to think differently about this disease. And I think that's why we actually lead the science on the podiums now. We actually are looking into flow and left ventricular remodeling, things that were just never discussed when you talk about TAVR even 7, 8 years ago, 10 years ago. So this is not your father's TAVR. And I think we've taken a very different approach because of that different industry background.
And I want to tap into that really. So at what point did you think did you realize that you thought differently about strategy compared to all your peers around you? Like you mentioned that you came into the company as a pharma company and pivoted. There must have been a time where you was talking almost like a different language to the people around you, right?
Yeah, Jordan, I think I still do at times. Not in the company, for sure. And I remember a lot of the early discussions where I would just scratch my head, and it was not comfortable, with some of the folks that were from the medtech side of the business, when I would say, why do you do that? And it wasn't, I wasn't trying to, offend people. I was literally coming from a different perspective. I'm not saying it's better or worse either. There's definitely pros and cons to both industries, no question about it. But I think it's when you can merge both. But you will not find a lot of pharma people in medtech, and you won't find a lot of medtech people in pharma. So that cross-fertilization doesn't happen a lot, and wouldn't have happened to me other than this was a drug company. Otherwise, I wouldn't have even been invited to be here. But when I realized, I guess, I just had a paradigm for how you treat a patient, how you look at total disease management, and how you bring a product to market. Like I said, I've done it 36 times in my career. And so that's a lot of training. That's even a lot for a pharma person. So it's not a small number. And with that comes learnings. As I got into this space, I had to study the space in order to pivot, right? This was a public, or is a public company. I'm using shareholder money to take gambles and risks. And so I better be sure, and this goes beyond your industry training. This is your business training kicking in. I better be sure that if I'm pivoting to this space, that I'm looking at something that has a chance, that's viable, that's worthy of getting shareholder money to invest in, and also being willing to make the decision to shut it down if we didn't get there. Like, so knowing where the hard stops were, clinically better was one of those, for example. So I think, yeah, it's not necessarily, and I think one of the things that I did understand very early is that total disease management is total disease management, is how pharma looks at the world. It appeared to me, at least in TAVR, I'm not saying medtech, but in TAVR, they were definitely not looking at it from that perspective. It was more about the physical properties of the valve opening and closing. And that's why they're not curative. And that's why they don't look like the native anatomy. And that's why we had the opportunity to make the first biomimetic valve, which is a single piece 3D molded valve, that certainly looks like the valve in your body and behaves like it and puts you back into the state the doctors asked us for. So I think, along the way, I've learned a lot about medtech as well. And there's a lot of very positive things that I've been able to integrate into my way of thinking. And then it just comes down to business planning and execution, which of course you learn anywhere. You can learn it at Coke or McDonald's. And so I subscribe a lot to consumer marketing, always did in my career. And of course, with my multinational career, you learn a lot of cross-cultural aspects of communication, which actually help you across industries as well. Like if I'm in Japan and I can't read, write, or speak the language, and yet I'm the boss, you're illiterate for all intent and purpose. You better learn real quick how to read the tea leaves and how to execute and do those things, because the culture is different. Even if you're industry, you're still obviously in pharma. And I applied that back a little bit between medtech and pharma. It's a little bit like that, where you've got to read the tea leaves to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And look, we did things here that Wall Street told me was not possible a decade ago. When I said we're going to make a new TAVR, basically Wall Street said, no, you're not. When I said to the strategics who I've known for many years at the senior leadership level, I made it, my mission to meet them very early and continuously, and have done that for many years. And those folks would be also saying, look, you're not going to get this done. And I thought, okay, that's where the pharma mindset is very clear. You're going to look at the disease, you're going to work out the solution to that problem, and you're going to go for it, as opposed to, I'm not going to get it done. But the perception is because you're a smaller company, we might be small in scale, but everyone here is coming from big pharma or big medtech. They've all done this stuff before. So that's a huge strength for our company.
Well, what made you believe that TAVR was the opportunity? Because you mentioned that you was almost, close to having to fold the business. There must have been something that you saw that really stood out to you at that opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you just go back to, Porter's 5 Forces, or the basic tools you learn at business school, you look up, assess a market. And remember, I'm looking for an investment thesis, or I'm going to stop the company.
Mm-hmm.
And an investment thesis can't be $200 million, right? It has to be big. Now, TAVR is the biggest, or one of the biggest spaces in medtech, at 10 billion, and that's only treating 15% of patients. So the TAM is actually 20, 30, or 40. It's a very big space. But there is a rate limiting factor. The base material that you make a valve from is a collagen material. The company did have that in its portfolio. They were using it in surgical repair, which is a $100 million space, right? And very commoditized, as I said earlier. It is the barrier to entry. You can't just make this collagen material overnight. So I was looking for there were multiple applications for this stuff. No one, I guess, was bold enough to go at TAVR before, even if they had this stuff. And I'm like, there's only one way forward for this company, or shut it. And it's got to be, the go big or go home kind of approach. You have to be realistic. You can't just say, well, I'm going to invent time travel because that seems like a good idea. It's got to be okay. That's when you set up the target product profile. You say, okay, I see the space. It's very large. You got two players who haven't really moved the needle a whole lot, and they're only treating 15% of the patients, and it's a fatal disease. So all these things are very appealing. If you've worked in healthcare your whole career like I have, there's certainly a Maslow impact of bringing good products to market to help patients. That's definitely part of it as well. But when you look at the space, is it realistic? Can I get in there, and what's the gap? And that's why I brought those physicians down who were the biggest users in the country and still are at the time, and say, help me understand the gap. And then I'm going to assess whether I can get into that gap. And then I'll assess whether there is in fact an investment thesis at all. And I think because it's a very methodical approach to the disease, to the solution, to creating an investment thesis and to having your gating items, your go, no goes. A lot of folks haven't seen that before in Wall Street. From a small cap, a lot of small companies are made up of founders who are looking for an exit. I wasn't looking for that. I was looking to build a better product. In the background, if you create a better product that's clinically viable, it has a chance of being, commercially viable as well. And that drags your investment thesis along. And that's frankly where we landed.
Very nice. And so when you sat down with these leading TAVR physicians, what were they actually asking for?
Yeah. So the two things that they really came out that day, and it was, I presented our collagen. Firstly, I brought them first thing. I mean, you're talking about Cleveland, Columbia. I mean, the biggest TAVR centers out there. They didn't know me. My therapeutic areas are oncology and other areas in pharma. So I didn't have the network there. They all came down to Minneapolis, had that meeting. There was obviously some skepticism that day, but they were curious. Presented the collagen, said, here's the building block. I've got that. We're good. What do you need if? And the answer was, look, clinically better, right? And that meant better than the two products that they were using. And that meant getting out of that 20 millimeter of mercury mild disease range off the table. So what does that look like? And a balloon expandable delivery system. Now, there are two kinds of delivery systems in TAVR. One is self-expanding. That device has 30% market share in the States and has consistently had that for a decade. The other one is balloon expanding, which is clinically not as good as the self-expander, but has 70% market share. It's easier to use. So unlike a drug, and this was a huge learning, a TAVR device specifically has a physician on the end of it that's implanting that catheter through your femoral artery, which is down near your groin, driving it up through your vasculature over your aorta to get that valve in place that you otherwise had to crack a chest for and get your hand in there and not that simple, but so it's really intricate engineering. But if the physician cannot get the valve up and around the aorta and put the valve where it needs to go, it doesn't matter how good your valve is, right? So there are definitely two parts to the equation. Take a drug, there's only one part, clinical. So either clinically works or it doesn't, because if you're going to administer it through a syringe or orally, the delivery is not part of the picture, whereas in medtech, it is absolutely part of the picture. And so the balloon expandable system obviously is a lot easier to use. And they were very clear with me, you've got to hit the clinical side with the valve, but man, you better get the catheter right as well. And they did not want the self-expanding device. So we went down that path. Now, the other thing was really critically important, which physicians will tell you now who work with us and still work with us. A lot of med techs had approached these people, of course, in the past, because they're very important doctors. Asked them what they wanted, whether it's TAVR or something else, gone away 3 years later and handed them something back. And the doctors will tell you, yeah, that's kind of what I asked for. We didn't do that. We brought them to Minneapolis. We have labs here. Minneapolis is medtech central, so you've got a lot of infrastructure, cadaver labs, animal labs, all sorts of engineers in this space because the headquarters of the big companies are here. We brought them to Minnie constantly, sometimes weekly. They were working with the engineers in our labs to get these things right in animals and then in cadavers later. So we didn't just walk away, try and make it and hope 3 years later we got it right. These guys were hands-on all the way. And so because you have that level of input, we hit the clinical, which meant changing the valve design, right? That was very clear. We made one that was physiologically and anatomically correct, put patents all over that, of course. And we got the patients down to 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury, every single patient for the 140 that we've done. And that's the normal range. And we treated patients who had up to 100 millimeters of mercury. And I've been in a lot of these procedures. The catheter had to be as easy or easier to use than the market leader. And we hit that one as well. But it took a while. But once I knew we got the clinical part right, I was confident we could get the engineering on the catheter right. And that investment thesis started to build around the plan that I'd already put in place. It means I could raise capital. It wasn't easy. People had to kind of trust you without human results and things, but they did. And finally, you start to move along into the point where we are today, which, of course, is in our final registration study, which has commenced globally.
Amazing. And what's the difference? You mentioned there, like the raising of the funds. You've obviously done this in pharma and you've now done it in medtech. Is there a massive difference on how it's done fundamentally?
There is, and I'll tell you, it's not about pharma medtech. It's about corporate and startups, if you want to call it that. This is not a startup, but it's a publicly traded company, which it probably shouldn't have been when it was on the ASX as a drug company. But that's by the by. When you're in big corporate, I was in the C-suite of a big drug company at the end there. you don't touch the capital markets. You don't talk to funds. If you're talking to the capital markets, because you have capital markets day where you present once a year with the CEO and the chairman and so on, and the biggest banks out there are coming up and shaking your hand and saying thank you, right? So I came into this space not to be the CEO, to be the chairman, and I was sitting on a NASDAQ board in California at the same time. So I was starting my board career in my 40s, and had no intention of doing any of this other than, the company was obviously in a lot of trouble, and it was publicly traded. If it wasn't, I probably would have just walked away, honestly. But then I had to learn how to raise capital. Now, obviously, I understood the workings of the NASDAQ and the NICE and Wall Street, but hadn't really had to raise capital at all. And when I did face capital at Merck, it was very big banks, very famous banks, billions of dollars involved there. And suddenly you find yourself putting the investment thesis together, pursuing it, executing on it, knowing that you haven't got all the data, and you don't even know whether you're going to get there at that point. It's too early. You're not pretending you will. You're being very honest with people. I think one of the problems I had was just kind of talking to the investors and learning that you can be as honest as you want. That at that level where you are, you're dealing with funds that are pretty much down the food chain. And that's what I learned. There are funds and funds and funds. Now we deal with incredibly large, professional New York healthcare funds. But back in the day, it wasn't the case. And so you're having to do pretty scrappy deals with folks who don't care about investors. They certainly don't care about the outcome of the product. They care about whether they can get free warrants, flush the cash, and basically churn with the market. And you're stuck. There's no way around that, right? You're in that situation. If you haven't got a viable company at that point and you're building a development product without revenue, that's going to happen. And one or two things will happen. You either crawl out of the primordial ooze along the way there, or the company will collapse because your product isn't going to get there. And I think part of that is probably a lack of a plan. But we had that plan 10 years ago, 8 years ago. Like I said, the target product profile, the gating items, the go, no-goes, we just have to keep following it. And at some point, you lift out of that position and you start to talk with really important funds. And, when people look at our register now, often in New York, and I'm in New York regularly, they're saying, how did you get this fund? How did you get that fund? Meaning the funds, the healthcare funds on our register are very, very credible. And so that's a function of executing on your plan and obviously bringing something forward that is actually an investment thesis, that people can actually see a path where they may make money out of that investment.
So being a public company, you've often got eyes on you, and there's not a lot of things that you don't get seen for. What have you been doing behind the scenes over the last 5 years that people don't see?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jordan. You're right. You obviously have not just the eyes on you. You have regulations that require you to disclose everything, and of course you do, because if you don't, you end up in an orange jumpsuit somewhere, which I'm sure I don't look good in orange. But you have to disclose everything, and it's interesting because you end up with two kinds of shareholders. You end up with your funds and institutions, and then your mom and dad retailers. And this company's register base was all or mostly mom and dads back in the day, and now it's not. And so there's two different mindsets, right? The mom and dads naturally tend to have a little less information and assume if the share price is moving up and down with the stock market, there's something wrong with the company. To which my normal response is, if there was, I have to tell you that's the law. I can't, so you don't have to second guess. If I'm not telling you something, it's because it's not happening. And the institutions worry less about that because they have very big portfolios and you make up a very small part of their portfolio, whatever. But what happens behind the scenes, I think the things that clearly you don't, it's not about disclosure, you just don't need people to get into it, is, that development curve is long, right? And you have failures. And I don't mean in patients or humans. I mean, when you're developing a catheter, it takes you 3 years. You go through life cycles of different catheters and things like that. Because if you want to make sure the investment thesis is solid, you can't just be one and done, right? So we develop a catheter, you can implant with it, was fine, but it wasn't easier to use than the market leader. So we had to keep going, and we had to keep going until we hit the remit that says I can sell that. Doctors will use it. So there's a lot of that going on in the background. I think the valve from the get-go, once we had that worked out, I mean, it has been amazing from patient 1 to 140. exactly the same results, pre-disease curative. But you have time to work that out on special machines that can tell you how it's going to function in a human. Of course, you do it in animals and other things. So there's a lot of that. I think there's a lot of tap dancing as well for me personally with, with all the stakeholders, whether it be, the FDA or investors in general. So you spend a whole lot of time that is not just running the company, right? It's managing these big funds, making sure that they fully understand that you're not full of it, right? That you've got a plan and you're sticking to it. So those are the key things.
I'm interrupting this episode to bring you a word from our sponsors, TTP. TTP is a leader in complex medical technology development with deep scientific and engineering expertise. They support ambitious medtech companies in solving high-risk, high-complexity challenges where there's no margin for error. Whether you're tackling uncharted technical territory or racing to bring a product to market, TTP provide clarity and direction. By de-risking innovation and ensuring seamless alignment with regulatory and manufacturing demands, TTP help you move forward with speed and confidence. To find out more, check out the show notes.
Amazing. You've touched on it a few times about the sort of success you're having with your trials, etc. What makes DurAVR fundamentally different to what's currently available on the market?
Yeah, so it comes back to that. If we take away delivery for a minute, because the catheter we talked about has to be easy to use, but you throw it away, right? Once you've planted the valve, so then it all becomes about the payload, right? Now that valve, go back to what I said earlier, fatal disease, no drug to treat it. If left untreated, you will die, and the only way to deal with it is to switch out a piece of the anatomy, which is the valve. The aortic valve is the one at the bottom of the aorta, which becomes dysfunctional, which is why that blood pressure goes right up, and that's what people die from. And the whole industry had been using a valve design called bioprosthetic. Whether it's a surgical valve or a TAVR valve, they're all, believe it or not, the same, which is 3 pieces of flat tissue, the collagen, sewn into a frame with hundreds of sutures. And they're not physiologically or anatomically correct. So they weren't getting physiologically or anatomically correct results. You take a 22 mil Sapien, the smaller size, and you'll see those patients are getting off the table. And there's so much data on these products, which is great. You don't have to guess. Lots and lots of published papers, as you can imagine, over 10 years. And you'll see these patients get off the table with 20 millimeters of mercury every single time. So that's mild disease. And what happens is that valve starts to fail, right? And as it fails, you end up in moderate and you end up back in severe. Right? And if you live long enough, they'll have to go in again and do another replacement valve. And that becomes very challenging, called valve and valve. Then when we started the space, they were treating very old patients. I would equate them to stage 4 oncology, end of life. And they would die in a couple of years before you saw any of this problem. And so it wasn't even necessary to get them into a pre-disease state because they're quite old and you're just keeping them alive. And in fact, the market leader was saying this is a valve for life. And of course it was, because the guy was dead in 3 years. They don't say that now. Fast forward to 8-9 years later, they're saying choose your first valve. Why is it? Because you probably end up with a second one. We understand why these valves fail now, but we went about, because the doctor said clinically better, we started with the same bioprosthetic design that everyone uses, 3 pieces of tissue. And we couldn't get it to give you the mean gradients of 5 to 10 millimeters, which is what we're looking for. That's normal. I knew if we ended up with 20 millimeters, it's the same result as the market leader. No one's going to buy that. So there's no point creating a me too. That's not an investment thesis. And so that forced us, when we realized we couldn't get that bioprosthetic design to do any more than what the others were doing. I don't know why we thought we could actually, but we tried, because we were pursuing the investment thesis and what the physicians wanted. We end up recreating the valve completely, and that's why we created the first new class called a biomimetic. And it's a single piece 3D molded valve, which looks like the valve in your body and behaves like it. Lo and behold, it's physiologically anatomically correct. We're getting those 5 to 10 millimeter of mercury mean gradients. On the back of that, we're getting normal laminar flow, which is the only product that does that. Laminar flow is so critically important because it leads to one of the mortality functions of this disease, which is heart failure, which is a function of high back pressure. So we got a whole bunch of benefits that we weren't seeking because we ended up with this very different design. But kind of the lights went on. It makes sense as you're going through the journey, trying to get what doctors want, going, why are we putting a square peg in a round hole, which is essentially what it was. I always talk about a car analogy where you've got a car, it gets a flat tire, and you put a square wheel on it instead of a round one, and the square wheel will work, but it won't work like it should. And that's what they were doing. They're putting a valve in there that does not look like the one you were born with, and certainly doesn't behave like it. And so once we work that out, that's why the clinical results are different. It's a function of that valve. But like I said, you've got to be able to land it with that catheter. And so there was a lot of work went into the delivery system, and it is as easy or easier to use than the market leader, and every physician who's used it will certainly attest to that. So yeah.
We've talked a lot about how you've got to where you are and the things you've been achieving on the way. Let's talk a little bit about where Anteris is right now. Whereabouts are you as a business?
Yeah, so I mean, happily, we're obviously in a position where all of that planning and execution comes to fruition. You prove the point. So a couple of things you see there is obviously the patient numbers that we've done so far is a very large number of patients for a pre-registered product. People will do 30, 40 to get into their final registration study. We did 130 because I wanted to de-risk it completely along the way. So we did more of these early stage patients, and we did very, very sick patients deliberately. We were trying to break it. We were trying to prove or find where the gaps were, because I didn't want to get into the registration study and have that fall over, because then you've lost your investment thesis. So having said that, we were treating patients with 100 millimeters of mercury mean gradients. We did a patient with a double. We did his mitral and his aortic both with DurAVR. We've done valves, which are really hard to treat, where they had one of the two valves out there failed, and we put another valve in because these are very sick patients. And so when we did all of that, and then we got into where we are today, which is our registration study. So it's a global study, FDA study, Europe and the US. We get the CE mark, of course, and the FDA approval. It's the first randomized registration study, so it's head-to-head against the two products in the market. I wanted that because we're going to have that data. It's going to be a seminal publication when it comes out, because we're addressing as our secondary endpoints hemodynamic superiority, left ventricular remodeling, laminar flow, and the patients we have in a study will be assigned to either the market leader or the two products as well as ours. It's the first time that data is being captured with MRIs and echoes where you actually be able to see it. And the reason is because this product is about 30% clinically superior at the moment to what's out there. We see that objectively. That's already been published and put out there on podiums. So it's a very public number. So we're right in the sweet spot. And that's why you see this last capital raise was a record for a non-revenue medtech company. And of course, we brought in the biggest medtech company in the world as a partner on the register. So it validates where the clinical. So I mean, this product is extremely well known, by the way. It's globally with physicians, with Wall Street, with all of the strategics, all of the big companies know this product because the data is so compelling, and the design being so radically different, of course, has caught everyone's attention. Of course, we have all the IP around it, so they can't copy it. They've got to kind of come and join the party or lose market share ultimately when we launch.
You've just breezed over something absolutely significant that I wanted to talk about it in the podcast. You've just had a huge public offer and support for the next stage of growth. How did that come about? How long has that been in the pipeline for?
Yeah, so obviously as a public company that's non-revenue like us, you're raising capital. And I talked earlier about some of the deals you have to do early on, and some of the funds you have to work with, frankly, are the bottom of the ladder. I mean, I could only put them that way. They're not there to help investors. They're not there to follow the thesis and bring a product to market. They're there to kind of fleece as much as they can on the way through, shuffle their warrants and options, and then you get to the point where we are today. So it's been years of raising capital, like 8 years, and a lot of learnings along the way, to the point where credible medical funds with experts in their company who are talking to you, the same people who can pick up the phone and talk to any one of these physicians globally, the people that we work with, are you kind of migrate up the food chain, if you like. Now, we started to bring in these kind of folks 3-4 years ago, from New York before we were listed on the NASDAQ. They were investing on the ASX. Some good healthcare funds who would see the patient data. They knew what they were looking at. They could see the opportunity. So quite a few years to get to the point where this last raise, the data is so compelling. We're in the final study and so on. And so you see that response. We were four times oversubscribed for that raise. And I've never raised anything like that. I mean, it's a huge number. Obviously, it puts us in a good position because I was always under the hammer with cap raises. And so that becomes quite a challenge. I think the other thing is the strategic partner that joined that. So we end up raising $320 million US. It's a decent number. We talk and continue to talk to all of the companies who have reached out or vice versa over the last 5-6 years. So be it, Edwards, Medtronic, Abbott, Boston, J&J, all of those companies know us at the senior leadership level and continue to talk to us very regularly. Medtronic being one of those. We kind of have our choice of partners, I guess, to some extent at this point. This represents, if you think about the market, it's $10 billion. Like I said, that's pretty underpenetrated. 2 players, and we've shown clinical superiority and ease of use. And if the market leader has 70%, what does it look like for us? Is it 10, 20, 30? Of course, it's somewhere or a lot higher for a bunch of reasons that the people know. And so Wall Street knows, the doctors know what this product is. Then you start to look at a $3, $4, $5 billion top line revenue product. Now, at Merck, I had a bunch of those. At Roche, I had a bunch of those. But medtech doesn't have a bunch of those, right, in their portfolios. And you start to see, when I say we can pick and choose, once you're de-risked on the clinical side, and remember, whether it's Medtronic or Edwards, whoever, they're talking to the same doctors we work with, right? These are the same people at that level. They're not tier 2 or tier 3. And so they're getting the feedback from the physicians. They're seeing it on the podium. They're seeing the data. They're hearing the analysts from Wall Street. And they understand that it is a multi-billion-dollar top-line revenue product that every CEO wants. I wanted that back in the day in pharma. I mean, you can put as many of those on your top line. You worry about the bottom line later. And so this becomes a very desirable asset coming out the other side of the FDA. The challenge for everybody, of course, and I guess the thing that, we've had offers to buy the company along the way, multiple offers. And I rejected them because they just didn't line up with the value that this product represents for my shareholders. And the one thing I wouldn't do is sell cheaply and screw all of those shareholders who supported us so some other company can walk in and take it away after, none of the pain, none of the suffering, and certainly none of the investments along the way. And so we're in that position. We can absolutely launch. We wrote the launch plan 8 years ago. It's a very compact market. I've launched a lot of products, far more than anyone else, I would say, in our medtech space, as have people in my company. And so launching was planned. And if you know what you're looking at, we're at stage 15 of 25 steps. A lot of the bigger companies would say you can't launch. And so we were able to reject them and just keep going. And there's a point where we are, where there's partnerships and synergies with a strategic or not. And I think that's something we have calculated for. We're certainly by no means about to sell the company tomorrow at this market cap, where we look for co-commercialization opportunities. Like I did a lot of those in pharma. They're not common in medtech, but I'm optimistic. And now we chose, Medtronic of all the offers we get to bring on the register, because I think their ethical approach to clinical data, their transparency, that certainly aligns with my values. The way they talk about patients certainly aligns to my values. And we get to talk to all of these companies. They don't get to talk to each other the way we talk to all of them, which is interesting insight because you get to pick and choose. And we certainly chose, the potential partnership around what does it bring to my investors? What does it bring to patients? What does it bring to the table? And the values have to align. And there are companies out there whose values absolutely do not align with mine, and I just would not contemplate. And the same was true in pharma. So that's not unusual. Then what are their commercial abilities? Can they help me if I go to the market and I want to split up the territories? Could I give them Asia and they'd be okay there while I take North America and so on? So these are the questions we grapple with. They may have a different view. I think the view at some of the bigger companies is certainly one where they don't necessarily fully understand a small company can launch. because most of the small companies they deal with cannot. So I guess they're dealing with a company here they're all big corporate people with a smaller footprint. But we found common ground. So I'm happy with where we are. We've got capital for multiple years moving forward, so we can get the job done without the worry of that. And now it's just executing on this very seminal study that's happening, which is the head-to-head study where we end up with approvals in the US and Europe.
Let's talk about that then. So obviously that's primarily what this raise was for, right? What does the next 12 to 24 months look like if everything goes well?
Yeah, so this is going to be a relatively quick study to recruit. It's in and around 1,000 patients, but randomized. So 500 of those are DurAVR, 500 are standard of care, which would be either the Edwards product or the Medtronic product. And the primary endpoint is non-inferiority, which is all stroke, all-cause mortality, rehospitalization. Pretty standard endpoint. And then we've got a bunch of secondary endpoints which have never been addressed, clinical superiority to the current products. So, these are critical if you want to launch, is to have these secondary endpoints. Obviously, they're not going to love that on the other side, the competitor side, but they'll be really valuable for our commercial launch. So that study should recruit out into Q4 of this year, Q1 of next year. And there's a huge demand both in Europe and the US to recruit that study, of course. It is such an important study for TAVR, and everybody knows that. The process for us moving from there is a 12-month follow-up, and that 12 months is really important. So you start to look at so that's the FDA, we finish the study, do a 12-month follow-up, and then pretty much submit, get your approval, go to market. We have capital to cover us all the way through there. We have manufacturing footprint in 2 countries, one for the collagen material I talked about earlier, and the other for the valves and the catheters and so on here in Minneapolis. We can scale for about 2 years post-commercial, and we'll start to work it out from there. The field staff and headcount when you go to launch is not significantly larger in the field than the people you have out there running the study. So going to market is actually not the proposition a lot of folks think it might be, because you have people running your study that work for the company as you have to clinical trial monitors convert to the field staff. And we've got to add another 20 to 30 at that point, which you do in that 12-month follow-up period. You're building inventory, you're training additional field staff, blah, blah, blah. So you're basically getting ready for launch, I think, is the way to look at it.
Amazing. You've had a lot of time to, break into medtech a little bit now. When you zoom out from it all, and particularly just from TAVR, what do you think structural heart gets wrong today in other areas?
Yeah, I think if I look at the industry in general, I think there's been a lot of great products in structural heart for sure. Very, very notable. And they're coming under some competition now, right? We see that with Watchman and other products as well. You see the mitral space kind of tricuspid comes and goes. So I think, I don't know if it gets anything wrong. I just think there's a lot of still unserved medical needs or unmet medical needs. I think TAVR was certainly one of them. Like I said, this is not your father's TAVR. And so we took a very different approach to TAVR and to the disease management. And that's why we've landed on this kind of product that takes you into a more curative state with other physiological benefits along the way that may well lead to better mortality outcomes. And I think the industry is generally very engineering focused, as it needs to be. And I think that difference probably overrides what is it that we're really looking at from a disease point of view, right? Are we looking to extend life? And I don't necessarily think TAVR certainly extended life from not treating a patient, but didn't really fully contemplate that suddenly younger patients would start to get the product, and they wouldn't die in their 80s after 3 years because the regulations allowed them to be used in younger patients. So I think life cycle management for me, if I was to be critical and look at it, often when I look at the pharma launches I've been involved in, you launch your first product, a big biotech in cancer, right? I did a lot of oncology. And your second and third gen is pretty much ready to go out the door, right? I don't see that life cycle management in structural heart, and clearly that left a gap for us to go into. If we look at mitral, it's a very challenging area. We've moved from maybe replace to edge, and I still think there's a lot more work to be done there. Surprisingly, you look at the mitral clips and then the Pascals and these kind of products, the data I've seen that doesn't really move the mortality curves a whole lot, right? So we're treating and we're getting some outcomes there, but mitral being so challenging, and I don't think but maybe it is a very difficult valve to get to. Obviously, it's in a different space there, but I think, it looks like the market has settled on edge-to-edge repair, the TAVR products. And I don't know if they're really moving the mortality curves. And so things like that, I think there could be more work done, working with the heart failure teams, for example, as opposed to just the interventionalists and the surgeons in certain spaces, to get that more holistic view on patient outcome, whether it's a combination of pharmacotherapy and the device. So I think there's a little bit more of that. I think there's a lot of progress being made in the last 5 years as well.
Cool. Something that I do want to touch on, I think it could be useful advice for other executives in the space. I know people don't always like answering this question. What advice would you give to traditional medtech leaders from a pharma side of things that they could try and implement, different fundamentals or different ways to look at things?
Yeah, look, you're right. The reason people don't like hearing it is because the guy at Chevy doesn't like talking to the guy at Ford or whatever. Pepsi doesn't like talking to Coke until they change jobs and switch over, and because the other guy always, you're going to know more. But I do think two things, to be fair. The pharma industry has existed for a lot longer. What does that mean? It means they've had longer to learn this stuff. It doesn't mean that medtech is behind. They're on a different point in their life cycle. The pharma industry is much, much bigger than the medtech industry. So there's a lot more investment, and there's a lot more that you can do from life cycle management, and whether it's expanding your footprint in China. I know at Roche, we built a couple of factories when I was there. Some of the smaller medtechs, they can't afford to do that. So you've got resources that they don't necessarily have. But I think the most critical one for me is just the difference in engineering versus a clinical approach. I'm not saying they're not clinical, but a lot of these devices were developed by engineers, as they have to be, right? The pharma side, as you go through drug discovery, you've got 60 phase 1 assets to get down to 30 in phase 2, to get down to 15 in phase 3, to get a couple out the door at the end of all of that. And you're constantly topping up your phase 1s. We were forever buying phase 1, phase 2s and companies in my old jobs. And it forces you to focus on the disease state, like I talked about before, total disease management. I don't see a lot of that here. And you're looking at curative outcomes. You're looking now in cancer, you look at 6 downstream regulators, right, to a tumor and molecular biology, where we used to have, chemo, which is just a shotgun, right? And so it's become a lot more articulate, and maybe that's the path I'm talking about. Now, where I see a lot of opportunity for medtech is obviously with AI.
Yeah.
And the convergence of proper tech, not engineering structural stuff, but actual really cool tech. There is a huge opportunity, whether it's diagnostics or whether it's, diagnostics is obviously huge for AI. That's where I see a lot of opportunity. I do think a lot of the med techs are very lethargic. I would say that when I look at the bigger ones, they tend to be so traditionally focused on a portfolio or a mechanical product, or and I don't necessarily see them moving with the future of healthcare. I think they will. So I think they're very conservative in their thinking. But yeah, really understanding total disease management and moving away from some of the portfolios. I look at some of the companies, they have portfolio that, the biggest one out there has a portfolio full of bits that I think should be put into a distributor in Tennessee somewhere. They're just not worthy of being in the portfolio. And some of these companies are very overstructured. They need significant reductions in headcount, bring the top line down to bring the bottom line up. So I see a lot of opportunity there. I think there'll be some consolidation. But I do just think it's really a function of where they are in their life cycle relative to the industry I came from.
Fair enough. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about hardship. Well, things have gone pretty good here. Like, it's gone pretty well as a first time into the medtech space. If you was to start over again, if you was to be at that same point where it was, am I going to fold the business, or are we going to flip the business and change it? From then to now, what would you have done differently?
I probably could have, in some cases, failed quicker. Like, fail fast is important. And the great thing is in medtech, you can, right? In a drug development process, You get into a study and your drug fails, it's game over, right? You can't manipulate the compound. It just goes on the shelf. And I've had a few of those in my career in phase 3. Nice thing about medtech, and the thing that I absolutely love about it, is that you can change things if they're wrong, right? Would I do it again? 1,000%. I wouldn't do it for a product I didn't care about or something small. Once I got into this, I realized this is a massive space and people die, and there is room for better treatments, and they will live better lives and live longer. That drives you a lot. That's not a throwaway line. If you've worked in healthcare like I have for nearly 3 decades and had the opportunity to bring 36 products to market, this will be 37. A lot of those have affected patient outcomes all over the world, wherever I lived. That's a very good feeling in the end, and I'm looking at this through the same lens. I would definitely try to fail quicker. I'd push things to move quicker, but everything's a function of resources. I would also make sure that in doing things the same, that you're addressing a space that has commercial viability, right? Because a lot of folks in this space set up companies in Minneapolis with an engineering view that I've created great product and everybody wants it. And it's not true, right? And so they end up going to the wall, or, end up with a very small, outcome for themselves financially or whatever. And I think also making very clear, which maybe I wasn't as clear on in the early days, that we are coming to market, that we can come to market, that we will launch, and that my gating items have been passed. So these are things I think communicating to the market's better. I was so caught up in raising capital from dubious sources, as it were, at the bottom of the food chain, that you're forever trying to balance so many balls. And so there's quite a few things there. But I think ultimately, if you look at it just from a generic point of view, you want to be looking at a space that has some barrier to entry, that has some reasonable revenue potential, and then understand that your product needs to be better than what's out there. You can't do a me too. You can do that in pharma, for sure, but you can't do it here. And so I think, getting that right, and then getting the backing, then getting the right people in your company. I mean, I think in the early days, one of the things that was slowing us down in some ways was that as a smaller company, you don't have brand equity that I had, say, at Roche or Merck, or I'm sure Medtronic and everyone else has. And so you're not necessarily getting the best people outside of the engineering, who I had the best people for sure. And this is what they created. But there's a lot of support people you need to run a company. And as you move up the food chain yourself, you're starting to get those people. I don't know if you can change that. I don't know if you can attract better people early on. I certainly tried. You tell the story, but there's risks. And a lot of folks in this town certainly have been in small medtechs that failed, and of course don't want to take that risk. Now we're at the point now where this brand is so well known that we get the most amazing people, even from coming from Medtronic and other places as well. And so I don't know how you overcome that, but that would be the one thing I would love to have changed way back when, is at some point in the company getting people who are more skilled and more qualified in certain functions outside the engineering function. But now we have, my head of manufacturing is a global head of manufacturing with TAVR from another company. My head of quality comes from the biggest out there, who's global head. My head of reg comes from the biggest out there, as global head of reg, and so it goes. So now you've got big corporate people who know what they're doing across the board.
I love that. David Israeli said the same thing to me when I spoke with him, the CEO of Magenta Medical, and one of his things was hire people smarter than you, better than you, and that was it. And I love that. I think it's absolutely right. Shout out the engineering team, by the way. It sounds like you've got a lot of praise.
Oh, I've got some killer engineers. I would say this, Jordan, it took nothing to be better than me at medtech, because I wasn't from this space. So I fully agree with that. There's no amount of humility that I can show to these people, and being humble to the fact that the folks who know what they're doing really know what they're doing. And that, this product doesn't just magically appear to be clinically better in the biggest space out there. But that's not just random, and it obviously takes years. It doesn't just happen. You've got to have the folks. You can put the vision down, you can put the milestones down, and you can execute on that. But I can't, right? I'm not the engineer or whatever. So you've got to have the folks who can deliver and run with you on that vision when everyone else is telling you, from Wall Street to the strategics, you can't make a TAVR product. You won't get in there. They won't let you. So it is down to the quality of those people, the engineers for sure. And these days, everybody else who's come along who really know what they're doing.
Fantastic. Is there any, well, you've already had a massive fork on the road day one when you decided to continue with the business. Where do you think the business could eventually be? Can you see you going into other indications? Is there anything that you can talk about, maybe that you could end up leading to?
For sure. I mean, things evolved as the TAVR space evolved. So this is, you talk about overnight success and good luck, and you hear those stories in entrepreneurial companies, which we very much are entrepreneurial. But it's very true for us. We started, and like I said, this is not your father's TAVR. That was pretty easy. What are they doing? What could we do better? Can we achieve that? These products were used in high-risk patients typically, and that's why you weren't seeing a lot of the problems, because those high-risk patients anyway were old and they die before the products really have issues. But as we started moving along the curve, the FDA was approving the use of TAVR in younger and younger patients. And we didn't foresee that, right? Why would you? So suddenly the patient population and dynamic is shifting, and the products that were in the market, they still weren't iterating them. They were designed for a different type of patient. They weren't designed for a 65-year-old who's going to live for a bunch of years, who has to be active and all those things. They were not designed for that patient. And so that opened up opportunity for us. That's the first one. The second one is valve and valve. When we started, there was no valve and valve, which means a replacement valve, because they were treating older patients who died before the valve failed. So in 2019, you really saw that big shift to low-risk patients. And the mean age dropped from 85 to 73, believe it or not, in 2 years. Right? It's now in the 60s, but 85 to 73 over 2021, around that period, around about COVID. And as you're seeing that group now being treated younger, we're going out 3, 4, 5 years beyond that point, we're seeing a huge uptick in valve and valve. Now, you talk to physicians, and no one really knows because it's such a new phenomenon, but they believe valve and valve to be about 30% by 2030 on top of the 10 billion. So there's another 3 billion, give or take. Now, these are very sick patients. You've got already a failed valve in there, so you've got a small space to work in. You can't open their chest, they're too sick. And so we didn't foresee that. Physicians approached us on valve and valve, said, can we use it? Compassionate use, North America and Europe. We said, yep. We weren't targeting that. And we were suddenly seeing results that were better than when they got their first valve, which is unheard of. When you get your second valve, your mean gradient's going to be 30. And we were getting better mean gradients than when they got their first valve. More recently, they did a triple. They did a valve and valve and valve in Stockholm. That guy's obviously very, very sick. He's had 1 valve failed, 2 valve failed. They came to us and said, can we put a DurAVR in there? Okay, we hope you do all right. That patient still got a better mean gradient than when he got his first valve on his third. So things like that, you talk about other indications and things that are opportunistic, and physicians don't have a good solution for valve and valve, so they're looking for this, are things that came about because we had a radically different design. It leads to all of these other opportunities. And then you look at, low risk, medium risk, high risk patients. We're getting all 3 of those labels in this study. It took the other guys 10 years to get those labels, and we're getting valve and valve in the same study. So as we saw the space evolve, and we led the science on the podium, believe it or not, if you ask any physician who leads the science in TAVR, they'll tell you Anteris. We are the number one. We talk about laminar flow, left ventricular remodeling. No one talked about those things, and we have the data to support it. That's why this product is so sought after. So again, that's more probably a bit of a pharma approach to looking at the disease. It just wasn't looked at before, but also the other products are not awesome in that space. And so as those opportunities came along, and we are serious about the disease management. We are serious about making it better for physicians as well as patients. And the physicians will tell you that. A lot of physicians have said to me, you forced me to think differently because you talk about it from an oncology point of view, stage 1, stage 4, and all that stuff. And so those are the opportunities that continue to evolve for us. And that's why obviously some of the strategic would dearly love to have this product in their portfolio, because it is going to take significant market share.
Amazing. Well, look, I've absolutely, got loads of information out of your day to provide people. I can't thank you enough for coming on the show, but I don't want to take up too much of your time today, Wayne. So I am going to end it there, and thank you very much for coming on. Really, really looking forward to what you guys are going to be doing with your study over the next couple of years. And best of luck with it all, Wayne.
Yeah, appreciate it. And it's been great talking to you, Jordan. That's been a lot of fun, so thank you.
If there's one thing this space has taught me, both personally and professionally, it's that progress in cardiovascular care is never the result of one individual. It's built by ecosystems, by teams, by people willing to take the long bets on hard problems. At Crux, our mission is to support that ecosystem through talent, capital, and community. The podcast is one small part of that effort, a place to share the real stories from people shaping the future of cardiovascular care. If you found value in today's conversation, I would love for you to follow the show and share it with someone building in this space. And if you're a founder, operator, or investor working on something meaningful in the cardiovascular care space, we'd love to hear from you.